What is going on, my fellow makers? Matt from Keep Making. Today I'm going to show you how I made a modular gaming board. Let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
Okay, so we're going to make two 2x2s, which will make a 2x4 later on. That is what's been requested by the commissioner here. So, starting off with these are pre-cut at the department store. So this is just a 2x2, and similarly, this is a 2x2 sheet of 1/8 plywood. So I'm going to score the back of the XPS foam, then I'm adding some PVA glue to the plywood, and then just clamping them together to get a good bond. While those sheets are drying, I'm going to start casting all of the rocks we're going to need for this build. This is just DAP plaster of Paris, and I'm using Woodland Scenics rock molds to create a bunch of rocks. Board is going to be similar to some boards I've done in the past, but kind of a combination of the two. So if you've seen my video on doing multiple boards in a few days, it's similar to some of those, including the floating rock section, so check out those videos. Once I have all the rocks casted, I print off a lot of fallen tree stumps and of course these floating island sections, and I'll leave links to all these STLs in the description below. To prime everything, I'm using this 2-in-1 Duplicolor. This is not only a primer, but it's a filler as well, and it's sandable. So I use this on all the prints because it's going to fill all the gaps between the layer lines. This primer is similar to any other primer you might use, but first you're doing 2 thin coats of it, and then you're going to do a very thick third coat, which will bond to the primer that's already on there and start to fill those gaps. Once they've been primed, we're going to come in with some white primer, go over the top just with the zenithal highlight to give it a little bit more dimension and simulate some lighting effects. Back in the basement, once the XPS and the plywood have bonded to each other, I'm just going to cut off the excess XPS with an X-Acto knife. There you go. Before we move any further, let's get into the layout of this board. Again, 2 2x2 sections which will slot into a 2x4, and this is going to have 3 configurations. So the first of which is going to be just these boards as they are, and the layout for the individual boards is pretty similar, but they'll slot together so you can have one big rock formation of the 2 halves on either side there, or you could slot them against each other, and that way you can have 2 mirrored sides kind of going at each other. So there's a little bit of variance in playstyle, and obviously the floating islands will sort of break up any parts that are too uniform. So now that I have a design, I can begin sketching it out onto the XPS foam, and you'll see in the middle there, that's where the rock formation is going to meet. There's a couple ways to do that, and I'll show you how I ended up tackling it here. But basically what I'm going to do is start piling up XPS foam. Now I want it to be cut a little thinner than I've drawn out the line. That way the rocks that we've casted can fit on there and still fit within that shape. I'm not really beholden to that shape, but it's a good guideline to go with. So I glue it onto one side, pull it apart, and then I'm going to make a straight cut across here. And that way I'll have a part that perfectly lines up with the other side, or at least that's the idea. Now that I have the other half of that rock formation cut out, I just add some hot glue to the back of it and I'll line it up perfectly with the other half. Now to make the other rock formations, I'm just going to be stacking up some XPS foam, and so I just cut it roughly to the shape. We want some variance so that when the rock molds actually go on here, it's not too uniform, but we're just stacking up XPS foam here, and we'll continue doing that for the rest of the rock formations as well. I want to cut the edges as well, just so that, again, it's not too uniform, too square or rectangle. Now, instead of doing this the same way I did the last time, because I have that rock formation on there now, it'd be pretty difficult to get a straight line. So I cut a straight line before gluing down the rock formation, line it back up, sketch out where I want the other half of this rock formation and what I want it to look like. And then I'm just going to come in with a hot wire tool and cut off the excess. I already know this line is straight on the back of there. So once I go to glue these two pieces together, I know they're going to fit nicely. Then from there, I'm going to do that same thing, just with increasingly smaller sizes of XPS foam. That way we have like a tiered step up as this rock formation gets higher. Okay, so now moving on to the actual floating bits. So the bigger pieces in this, everything's going to be made out of XPS foam, but the bigger pieces are going to be held up with an acrylic rod. I think it's 1/8 inch or maybe 1/4 inch. And then the smaller pieces are going to be held to that big piece with some clear sprue. So to make the big floating islands, basically I'm just going to trace out what I want the surface, like the playable area of it to be. I'm going to cut that out with a hot wire tool, and then I'm just going to keep adding smaller pieces that taper down towards the bottom, gluing those onto the main playable area, and then continue doing that until I get to a point. Once I've got up to the size that I want, I'm going to come back in with the hot wire tool, and I'm just carving into them, giving them more of a uniform look and trying to hide the lines between the parts that I've glued together. As I showed in my earlier sketch, I want a couple of these for each floating island, so it's the same process just on a smaller scale, and I keep making them until I have roughly enough to have at least a couple on every floating island. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be using some acrylic rod and some clear sprue to attach these all together. So I'm just using a drill bit by hand, drilling a hole into these bigger islands, fitting in the acrylic rod, and then I just continue that process and do, again, it on the same smaller scale for the smaller pieces. So I'm going to put these on a piece of XPS foam, and we'll come back to these a little bit later. Now moving back to the board's rock formation, so essentially what I do is I line it up with the XPS foam, I score a mark on where I want to break it, then I'm going to cut into it either with an X-Acto knife or a razor saw, crack it in half, and then hot glue this piece where it fits onto the XPS foam. And I just continue that process until I have as much as I can of this XPS foam covered, and then we're going to come back later on with some of the same casting plaster to fill any gaps. So here's how we're looking now that we've applied these to where we can get them onto the XPS foam, and we'll come back to fill those later on with some casting plaster. Before that though, we want to do some of the ground formations. So I'm just mixing up some, whether you use Sculptamold, Fast Mash, I'm actually using Celluclay because I couldn't get any Sculptamold quick enough. So it's just a casting plaster, mix it up here, and then I'm spreading it out over top, making sure that it's not too smooth or too bumpy, so we get sort of a natural ground formation. So I do this on top of all the rock formations, blending in all the rocks, as well as on the bottom to give a kind of natural lead up into this rock formation so it doesn't just feel like rocks stacked on top of grass. formations that need to slot back together, I put this modeling compound over both sides, and then I'm going to pull the board apart, trying to get as smooth as an edge as I can, and then I'll come back and clean it up later on. While that ground formation is drying, I can come back in and fill the gaps between all these casted rocks. So I'm mixing up the same casting plaster I used initially to cast these rocks, and I'm just stippling it into all of these areas, adding more where it's necessary, where I need to build up some formation, and just really kind of blending this all into one solid rock. So I tackle the floating islands in a very similar fashion, except I'm using this sponge which I've ripped up. This is going to give me more of a rock texture. I'm going to apply this all over these pieces. That way the casting plaster on the rocks on the base as well as the floating islands will be the same. Those textures will be the same. That way it's not going to look too cartoony on one or the other. Of course, the smaller bits get treated the exact same way. And then when those have dried, I can now start cutting the acrylic rod and sprue to size. To adhere them to the base, I'm just using some hot glue. I'm going to put it on one end of the acrylic rod, put that into the floating island itself, and then I'm going to drill a similar sized hole into the base and just hot glue it there as well. Once all the islands have been glued, I just come in with all the tree stumps and other terrain and I hot glue that as well. Now before I start adding any ground texture, I'm going to clean up this edge with some sandpaper just to make sure this is still flat or that ground formation has been placed over top. Using some just straight up PVA glue, watering it down, just water. I'm going to spread this all over the base and then I'm going to come in with some tile grout and that'll give us the ground texture. Dust off any extra tile grout that's gotten on the 3D prints or anywhere else that I don't want it to be permanently. Then I'll come in with some isopropyl alcohol and some watered down Mod Podge and seal this all into place. And now we can move on to the painting process. So I'm going to start with the rocks. I start off with this neutral gray. And this is being watered down. I just have this in a cup off camera here, and this is going all over the rocks. This will act as the base coat. Once the base coat is dried, I'm coming in with some oil paints here. So this is just some black oil paint. I'm going to thin it down with some oil thinner, and this will act as my wash. This gets into all the recesses, gives the rock some dimension, and this will be like our shadow layer. So we have the base coat. Now going in with the wash for some shadow, and after that we're going to come in with a highlight, which I'll show later on. highlight, I'm going to be using a dry brush with this slate gray. This is just a bit of a lighter gray. I'm going to use this to just hit the tops of those rocks, again bringing out some of that detail and giving us a third dimension to this color scheme. Ground, I'm just using a burnt umber craft paint. This is a really cheap dollar store paint. I water it down again in a cup, and we're just spreading this all over the base. I think I do about 2 or 3 coats here. To do all the fallen tree stumps or wood elements, I'm going to be using this model paint. This is just a light beige, and this goes all over. This is very watered down so that I can make use of that zenithal effect, having it a little bit watered down to let all that show through in a transparent layer so that those coats I put on earlier will still shine through. I do the same thing with all of the foliage and sort of vine growth and grass on here, keeping these paints really watered down. That way the zenithal will show through. Now, I'm not familiar with the names of these different type of mushrooms, but all these ones that kind of grow off the side, these will be done in a pink. Everything that's sort of, you know, the typical normal looking mushroom, that'll be done in a red. And then I just go in with a sort of beige paint to give them the dotting. And then I'm gonna hit everything with a wash. This is a mix of a umber wash and a green wash. To add some detail and dimension to the ground formations, I'm going in with a light beige over that burnt umber and just dry brushing all of that tile grout. That'll add some dimension and really give it a more detailed look. So once that's complete, I can come in again with some more watered down PVA glue and I'll start flocking. So to do this part, I start with some coarse textured flocks. I go in with both a dark green and a light green. This goes in the middle of areas, sort of where if there's any recesses or deep spots, this is where more moisture would pool up and you'd get, you know, better growth. And then I come in with the fine texture, so that'll be a mid-green grass, and then I go over that in some burnt grass just to highlight a little bit. It gets sprayed down with isopropyl alcohol the same way the tile grout did, and then sealed with matte Mod Podge. I can then start gluing these rock pieces into the sprue and then attaching them into the bigger floating island pieces. These acrylic rods have got pretty gunked up, and obviously we want them to be clear to simulate that floating effect. So I just come in with some 99% isopropyl alcohol with a cotton swab and just go over it all until I can scrub it off, and then I can start hiding the crime. So I'm going to be doing a kind of moss effect, so mixing PVA with some water and then some various ground textures. I grind up tea leaves and a bunch of stuff like that. This is going to go all over the area, say where the brown paint has spilled over onto the rock surfaces. We can cover that up. We can add some moss growth over these trees, really giving that overgrown look. Now, this was one spot on the board where the boards didn't quite fit together. There was a bit of a gap based off the way I cut it. So we're going to hide that by using some cork. So I'm just going to glue this onto either side, and similar to how we did that first rock formation that fits together, I'm just going to glue it, I'm going to flock it and tile grout it the same way I did with everything else, and then I'm just going to come in and cut it directly across the board. That way when we put these two boards together, they slot up perfectly. Then I can do the final step here, which is just cleaning up the trim or the perimeter of the board with some black craft paint.
So just some housekeeping things before we get into the final reveal. If you want to support this channel, please subscribe and like this video, share it with any maker groups or friends you have that also enjoy this stuff, and follow me on Instagram, keep_making. You can follow all my miniature paintings that I don't do many videos of here on this channel. If you want to support me financially, please do so at patreon.com/keepmaking. Anything you can goes a long way, helps me to keep making these videos. So without any further ado, let's get into the final reveal.
we begin?
Well, that'll do it for this video, guys. Make sure you've liked this video and you're subscribed to the channel. Hit that bell if you want to be notified when my new videos come out. And whether you're building something for yourself or something that's going to end up in someone else's basement, make sure you keep making it.